Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier. This presentation sets out to give you valuable context to solidarity, as well as explaining just why solidarity showed what was wrong in the Soviet bloc. Now, I always think context is important, but I think it's really important to consider the Polish context. Given Poland's history, we have to understand that Polish nationalism, and with it resentment of Soviet control, was particularly strong. Poland was carved up by the great powers in the 18th century, notably Austria, Prussia and Russia. Google the partitions of Poland if you want to know a little bit more. Then it was given a fresh start by the Paris peace treaties, only to be divided up again as a result of the Nazi-Soviet pact, subjected to total Nazi control as they swept eastwards when Hitler tore up the pact, only to end up as a part of the Soviet bloc as the Nazis were in turn pushed back. Catholicism was also strong in Poland, and the communists' repression of the Catholic Church was bitterly resented. And from 1978, the Catholic Church was led by a Polish pope. Still, with regard to context, after World War II, Poland was important to the Soviet Union's whole notion of a buffer zone. The Soviet Union had insisted that Poland's borders with the Soviet Union be pushed back westwards, compensated by Poland's border with Germany also being pushed back. Poland was the largest of the states under Soviet control and had the largest population, 35 million in 1979. Its leadership had been compliant. Vladislav Gomulka might have come to power as a result of the protests in 1956, and he was a Polish nationalist as well as a communist. But along with Walter Ulbricht in the GDR, he had pushed for something to be done about Czechoslovakia in 1968. However, throughout the years that the Soviet Union controlled Poland, there had been protests about the standard of living. For example, back in 1956. Wages, food prices, or both, and there was rationing in Poland, as well as poor housing and a lack of the kind of consumer goods enjoyed in the West. These were all issues. Gomulka was eased out of power in 1970 after protests about the rise in the price of bread. He was replaced by Edvard Gierek. Then things improved in the first half of the 1970s, with Polish industry modernized on the back of American and West German loans, and doing reasonably well. The pressure on the government eased as Poles were reasonably satisfied. Restrictions on the likes of censorship and the right to travel to the West had also been eased, and there was a degree of optimism for the future. However, by the end of the decade, any optimism that had existed had evaporated. Poland, like the rest of the world, had been badly affected by the 1973-74 oil crisis. Industrial production dropped as inflation took hold, and prices increased as wages were held at the same levels. And of course, those loans from the West had to be repaid. What made matters worse was that the Polish government didn't have any new ideas as to how to respond, just more of the same, price and wage controls. and more propaganda. But the propaganda could no longer mask the truth. In fact, it only increased frustration. There were already food and fuel shortages when in the summer of 1980 the government increased the price of meat, and strikes broke out all over the country, and small independent trade unions were formed. All of this so far has been context, critically important context. You cannot properly explain the rise and the importance of solidarity without it. But now we come to solidarity. A trade union formed by the workers in the Lenin shipyards in Gdansk in August 1980 and led by Lech Walesa. They barricaded themselves into the yards and presented the government with 21 demands. Now, in democratic societies, a trade union seeks to protect and improve workers' rights, for example, wages and working conditions. It acts independent of government, though it tries to influence it. But it mostly negotiates with the owners of industries on behalf of its members. In communist states, however, as in fascist states, trade unions continue to exist, but like everything else, they are controlled by the state, and so represent the state's interest, not the workers. Ironic in socialist states. This had been the case in Poland until 1980. Now, the demands made by Solidarity included well-formed traditional workers' rights, rights demanded by workers the world over, like the right to form free and independent trade unions and the right to strike, as well as more specific demands like more pay and improved benefits. They demanded the same pay as police and party workers, actually. But they also included more political demands, like the election of factory managers, an end to censorship, and a demand for the broadcasting of church services. So even though Solidarity was barely formed, it was making political demands as well as fighting for workers' rights. A clear sign that the one-party state system wasn't working for Poles, wasn't wanted by Poles. At the end of August, Gierek and the Polish government, in an unprecedented move, accepted all of Solidarity's 21 demands. By September, Solidarity had quickly established itself as a catch-all trade union. That is, attracting members from different occupations and different workplaces. It was independent of both the state and the Communist Party, even though some 30% of its members were also members of the Communist Party. Rural Solidarity was also set up as a farmers' union. And before the end of September, membership of Solidarity reached a staggering 3.5 million. By October this had doubled, and by January 1981 it reached its peak at 9.4 million members. Significantly, it was also supported by the Catholic Church, which it in turn supported. Again, clearly a sign that the one-party state system wasn't working for Poles, wasn't wanted by Poles. Why then did the Polish government give in to its demands, including the right to form free trade unions? Well, Poland was facing a major crisis, and we've noted that the government had no new ideas. Accepting Solidarity's demand could take the heat off the government, and what was given in the height of a crisis could be taken away later. Besides, the government had plans in place to impose martial law if things didn't improve. Solidarity was also incredibly popular. As we just noted, almost 10 million members in a matter of months. And it was supported by the Catholic Church, and the overwhelming majority of Poles were practicing Catholics. The fact that the new Pope, Pope John Paul II, elected in 1978, was a Pole was also significant. He had made a hugely emotional visit to the country of his birth in 1979 and would make others. Now, you could argue whether Solidarity was a threat to the Polish government. As we have noted, 30% of its members remained Communist Party members. And Lech Walesa worked with the government to control the more radical wing of Solidarity, lest they provoked the Soviet Union to send in tanks. And, again as we've noted, there were plans for imposing martial law. But really, Solidarity had quickly become a serious threat to the one-party state. As great a threat to Soviet control of its eastern bloc as Hungary and Czechoslovakia had been. Ultimately, more. So, I hope this has proven useful for you. I do try to present ways of looking at the issues you study in ways that can help you get that A star. Why aim for less? But let me remind you other ways that I can help you. There's my ebooks on Amazon, for example. And do check out my website, History Made Easier. But for now, as always, I'll thank you for listening. Cheers.